Institutes of Oratory by Quintilian. Translated by H.E. Butler. Published in the Loeb Classical Library, 1922. Book 8, Chapter 4. Amplification and Diminution. The first method of amplification, or attenuation, is to be found in the actual word employed to describe a thing. For example, we may say that a man who was beaten was murdered, or that a dishonest fellow is a robber. Or on the other hand, we may say that one who struck another merely touched him, and that one who wounded another merely hurt him. The following passage from the Pro Caelio provides examples of both. Quote, "If a widow lives freely, if, being by nature bold, she throws restraint to the winds, makes wealth an excuse for luxury and strong passions for playing the harlot, would this be a reason for my regarding a man who was somewhat free in his method of saluting her to be an adulterer?" End quote. For here he calls an immodest woman a harlot, and says that one who had long been her lover saluted her with a certain freedom. This sort of amplification may be strengthened and made more striking by pointing the comparison between words of stronger meaning and those for which we propose to substitute them, as Cicero does in denouncing Verres. Quote, "I have brought before you, judges, not a thief, but a plunderer, not an adulterer, but a ravisher, not a mere committer of sacrilege, but the enemy of all religious observance and all holy things. Not an assassin, but a bloodthirsty butcher, who has slain our fellow citizens and our allies." In this passage, the first epithets are bad enough, but are rendered still worse by those which follow. I consider, however, that there are four principal methods of amplification: augmentation, comparison, reasoning, and accumulation. Of these, augmentation is most impressive when it lends grandeur even to comparative insignificance. This may be effected either by one step or by several, and may be carried not merely to the highest degree, but sometimes even beyond it. A single example from Cicero will suffice to illustrate all these points. Quote, "It is a sin to bind a Roman citizen, a crime to scourge him, little short of the most unnatural murder to put him to death. What then? Shall I call his crucifixion?" End quote. If he had merely been scourged, we would have been but one step, indicated by the description even of the lesser offense as a sin, while if he had been merely killed, we should have had several more steps. But after saying that it was a little short of the most unnatural murder to put him to death, and mentioning the worst of crimes, he adds, "What then shall I call of his crucifixion?" Consequently, since he had already exhausted his vocabulary of crime, words must necessarily fail to describe something within worse. There is a second method of passing beyond the highest degree, exemplified in Virgil's description of Lausus. Quote, "Than whom there was not one more fair, saving Laurentian Turnus." For here the words, "than whom there was not one more fair," give us the superlative, on which the poet proceeds to superimpose a still higher degree. There is also a third sort, which is not attained by gradation, a height which is not a degree above the superlative, but such that nothing greater can be conceived. "You beat your mother." What more need I say? You beat your mother. For to make a thing so great as to be incapable of augmentation is in itself a kind of augmentation. It is also possible to heighten our style less obviously, but perhaps yet more effectively, by introducing a continuous and unbroken series in which each word is stronger than the last, as Cicero does when he describes how Antony vomited before an assembly of the Roman people while performing a public duty while master of the horse. Each phrase is more forcible than that which went before. Vomiting is an ugly thing in itself. He said when there is no assembly to witness it. It is ugly when there is such an assembly, even though it be not an assembly of the people. Ugly even though it be an assembly of the people and not the Roman people. Ugly even though he were engaged on no business at the time, even if his business were not public business, even if he were not master of the horse. Another might have broken up the series and lingered over each step in the ascending scale. But Cicero hastens to his climax and reaches the height not by laborious effort, but by the impetus of his speed. Just as this form of amplification rises to a climax, so too the form which depends on comparison seeks to rise from the less to the greater. Since by raising what is below, it must necessarily exalt that which is above, as for example in the following passage. Quote, "If this had befallen you at the dinner table in the midst of your amazing potations, who would not have thought it unseemly? But it occurred at an assembly of the Roman people." End quote. Or take this passage from the speech against Catiline. Quote, "In truth, if my slaves feared me as all your fellow citizens fear you, I should think it is wise to leave my house." End quote. At times again, we may advance a parallel to make something which we desire to exaggerate seem greater than ever, as Cicero does in the Pro Cluentio, where, after telling a story of a woman of Miletus who took a bribe from the reversionary heirs to prevent the birth of her expected child, he cries, quote, "How much greater is the punishment deserved by Opionicus for the same offense? For that woman, by doing violence to her own body, did but torture herself, whereas he procured the same result by applying violence and torture to the body of another." End quote. I would not, however, have anyone think that this method is identical with that used in argument, where the greater is inferred from the less, although there is a certain resemblance between the two. For in the latter case, we are aiming at proof, in the former, at amplification. For example, in the passage just cited about Opiniacus, the object of the comparison is not to show that his action was a crime, but that it was even worse than another crime. There is, however, a certain affinity between two methods, and I will therefore repeat a passage which I quoted here, although my present purpose is different. For what I now have to demonstrate is that when amplification is our purpose, we compare not merely whole with whole, but part with part, as in the following passage. Quote, "Did that illustrious citizen, the Pontifex Maximus Publius Scipio, acting merely in his private capacity, kill Tiberius Gracchus when he introduced but slight changes for the worse that did not seriously impair the constitution of the state? And shall we, as citizens, suffer Catiline to live, whose aim was to lay waste the whole world with fire and sword?" End quote. Here Catiline is compared to Gracchus, the constitution of the state, to the whole world, a signal change for the worse to fire and sword and desolation, and a private citizen to the consuls, all comparisons affording ample opportunity for further individual expansion, if anyone should desire to do so. With regard to the amplification produced by reasoning, we must consider whether reasoning quite expresses by meaning. I'm not a stickler for exact terminology, provided the sense is clear to any serious student. My motive in using this term was, however, that this form of amplification produces its effect at a point other than what was actually introduced. One thing is magnified in order to effect a corresponding augmentation elsewhere, and it is by reasoning that our hearers are then led on from the first point to the second which we desire to emphasize. Cicero, when he is about to reproach Antony with his drunkenness and vomiting, says, quote, "You with such a throat, such flanks, such burly strength in every limb of your prize fighter's body," etc. What have his throat and flanks to do with his drunkenness? The reference is far from pointless, for by looking at them we are enabled to estimate the quantity of the wine which he drank at Hippias' wedding, and was unable to carry or digest in spite of the fact that his bodily strength was worthy of a prize fighter. Accordingly, if in such a case one thing is inferred from another, the term reasoning is neither improper nor extraordinary, since it had been applied on similar grounds to one of the bases. So again, amplification results from subsequent events, since the violence with which the wine burst from him was such that the vomiting was not accidental nor voluntary, but a matter of necessity, at a moment when it was especially unseemly. while the food was not recently swallowed, as is sometimes the case, but the residue of the revel of the preceding day. On the other hand, amplification may equally result from antecedent circumstances. For example, when Juno made her request to Aeolus, the latter, quote, turned his spear and smote the mountain's cavern side, and forth the winds rushed in a throng. End quote. Whereby the poet shows what a mighty tempest will ensue. Again, when we have depicted some horrible circumstance in such colors as to raise the detestation of our audience to its height, we then proceed to make light of them in order that what is to follow may seem still more horrible. Consider the following passage from Cicero. Quote, these are but trivial offenses for so great a criminal. The captain of a warship from a famous city bought off his threatened scourging for a price. A human concession. Another paid down a sum of money to save his head from the axe. A perfectly ordinary circumstance. End quote. Does not the orator employ a process of reasoning to enable the audience to infer how great the implied crime must be, when such actions were but humane and ordinary in comparison? So again, one thing may be magnified by allusion to another. The valor of Scipio is magnified by extolling the fame of Hannibal as a general, and we are asked to marvel at the courage of the Germans and the Gauls in order to enhance the glory of Gaius Caesar. There is a similar form of amplification, which is affected by reference to something which appears to have been said with quite another purpose in view. The chiefs of Troy think it no discredit that Trojan and Greek should endure so many woes for so many years, all for the sake of Helen's beauty. How wondrous, then, must her beauty have been! For it is not Paris, her ravisher, that says this. It is not some youth or one of the common herd. No, it's the elders, the wisest of their folks, the counselors of Priam. Nay, even the king himself, worn out by a 10 years' war which had cost him the loss of so many of his sons, and threatened to lay his kingdom in the dust, the man who, above all, should have loathed and detested her beauty, the source of all those tears, hears these words, calls her his daughter, and places her by his side, excuses her guilt, and denies that she is the cause of his sorrows. Again, when Plato in the Symposium makes Alcibiades confess how he had wished Socrates treat him, he does not, I think, record these facts with a view to blaming Alcibiades, but rather to show the unconquerable self-control of Socrates, which would not yield even to the charms which the greatest beauty of his day so frankly placed at his disposal. Yet, we are given the means of realizing the extraordinary stature of the heroes of old by the description of their weapons, such as the shield of Ajax and the spear shaft of Achilles, hewn in the forests of Pelion. Virgil also has made admirable use of this device in his description of the Cyclops, for what an image it gives us of the bulk of that body, quote, whose hand was propped by a branchless trunk of pine. End quote. So, too, what a giant must Demoleus have been, whose, quote, corslet manifold scarce 2 men on their shoulders could uphold. End quote. And yet the hero buckled it upon him and, quote, drave the scattering Trojans at full speed. End quote. And again, Cicero could hardly even have conceived of such luxury in Antony himself, as he describes when he says, quote, you might see beds in the chambers of his slaves strewn with the purple coverlets that had once been Pompey's own. Slaves are using purple coverlets in their chambers? Aye, and coverlets that had once been Pompey's? No more surely can be said than this, and yet it leaves us to infer how infinitely greater was the luxury of their master. This form of amplification is near akin to emphasis, but emphasis derives its effect from the actual words, while in this case the effect is produced by inference from the facts, and is consequently far more impressive, inasmuch as facts are more impressive than words. Accumulation of words and sentences identical in meaning may also be regarded under the head of amplification. For although the climax is not in this case reached by a series of steps, it is nonetheless attained by the piling up of words. Take the following example. Quote, what was that sword of yours doing, Tubereau? The sword you drew on the field of Pharsalus? Against whose body did you aim its point? What meant those arms you bore? Whither were your thoughts, your eyes, your hand, your fiery courage directed on that day? What passion, what desires were yours? End quote. This passage recalls the figure styled sinotroispos by the Greeks, but in that figure it is a number of different things that are accumulated, whereas in the passage all the accumulated details have but one reference. The heightening of effect may also be produced by making the words rise to a climax. Quote, "There stood the porter of the prison, the praetor's executioner, the death and terror of the citizens and allies of Rome, the lictor Sextius." End quote. Attenuation is effected by the same method, since there are as many degrees of descent as ascent. I shall therefore content myself with quoting but one example, namely the words used by Cicero to describe the speech of Rutilius. Quote, "A few, however, who stood nearest to him suspected that he had intended to say something about the agrarian law." End quote. This passage may be regarded as providing an example of attenuation or of augmentation, according as we consider its literal meaning or fix our attention on the obscurity attributed to Rutilius. I know that some may perhaps regard hyperbole as a species of amplification, since hyperbole can be employed to create an effect in either direction. But, as the name is also applied to one of the tropes, I must postpone its consideration for the present. I would proceed to the immediate discussion of this subject, but for the fact that others have given separate treatment to this form of artifice, which employs words not in their literal, but in a metaphorical sense. I shall therefore at this point indulge a desire now almost universal, and discuss a form of ornament which many regard as the chief, nay, almost the sole adornment of oratory. End of On Amplification and Attenuation, Chapter 4 of Book 8 of The Institutes of Oratory by Quintilian.